The Indian healthcare services industry has grown steadily over the last few years, a trend that is likely to continue for a number of years to come, given the increasing investment in the sector and the importance it is in getting from both the government as well as private companies. Heading to our next discussion, we will touch upon the low-cost diagnostics, and we will also explore the different PPE model and pros and cons of distribution of labs, and we will also highlight the investor plan of recovering their investment post the pandemic. Fortunately, we are joined by a panel of top leaders of the field, and we have the moderator Dr. Aniruddha Malpani, founder and director, Malpani Ventures. Over to you, sir.
Hi, welcome to this panel discussion at the ET Health World India Diagnostics Summit. We're going to be talking on investments in diagnostics. And since we have major time constraints, I'm going to set some ground rules. I'm going to invite each of you guys. We've got a star panel here to introduce yourself. And then we'll cover about 4 to 5 topics. I'm going to request 2 people for each topic to spend about 2 minutes talking about it. I'm going to be fairly ruthless to make sure that our audience has a good time. So let's get kick started. Avinash, let's start with you, please. Can you introduce yourself?
I am Dr. Avinash Fadke. I am President and Mentor of SRL Diagnostics, and I have been a pathologist from 1980, practicing in this field for last 40 years plus.
Dr. Shravan, do you want to go next?
Thank you, Aniruddha. I'm Dr. Shravan Subramaniam, the Managing Director of Roche Diagnostics for India and neighboring countries. And it's a pleasure to be here during a time when over the last 90 days, diagnostics has had its day in the sun. Every day we've been in front page news, and this is something that we have been talking about the value of for the number of years. And now I think our time has come.
And we're going to be hearing a lot more from you, Shravan. Pancham?
Hi, I'm Pancham Mukim. I'm a managing director with the private equity business at Everstone Capital. I co-lead healthcare and consumer for the firm. Happy to be here.
Okay, Sunil.
Hi, I'm Sunil Thakur. I'm a managing director with Quadria Capital, leading healthcare-focused private equity fund. I lead the investments for the fund in South Asia. Pleased to be part of this esteemed panel.
Okay, and I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm an IVF specialist. I'm also an active angel investor, but I like describing myself as a patient advocate. What do we do in order to put the patient first? Because that's the reason all of us are here. So to set the ball rolling, it's clear, as Shravan said, is that this entire coronavirus crisis has emphasized the importance of diagnostics. And the reality is, unfortunately, healthcare has been consistently neglected for many, many years. But the point is, I don't want to talk about problems. I want to talk about solutions. I want to talk about what we can do in order to improve this situation so that our next generation has a better future. And I think the one thing we understand is that we should be treating this crisis as actually a huge opportunity. It's emphasized the importance of how much work we need to be able to do. And hopefully, healthcare will now become a priority area. And we will be able to fund it adequately so that healthcare will no longer remain the sick system. And that's the good thing about the virus, isn't it? We'll develop immunity to future epidemics if we do a good job right now. But the reality also is, I think all of us are suffering from COVID fatigue. Would you agree? And I don't really want to talk about, further band-aid solutions and what we're going to do, because at some point, life is going to carry on. So let's focus on the bigger picture. What can we use this crisis for to make sure that we can create a healthier diagnostic system? And the fact of the matter is that diagnostic testing is the heart of clinical care. Clinicians depend on diagnostic tests all the time, whether it's imaging, whether it's lab tests. And in the past, most testing was done by small laboratories, and they were great because they provide personalized care, but they had their own sets of issues. And the good thing about investment in these chains is that there is a lot more money, which means there's a lot more corporatization, there's a lot more standardization, more quality control. And I think that's a huge opportunity. So Dr. Avinash, you've been at this for many years. You've seen a lot of these changes. How do you think we can make the most of this? How can we get the investors to help us to take better care of our patients?
Yes, see, as all of us know, India is one of the countries in the world where the healthcare spend as a percentage of GDP is around 1.5%. So if we were to compare not with the Western world, which typically spend anywhere between 10 to 15% of GDP, but countries like Ceylon, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, as a percentage of GDP, spend more than India. And this is not political, because it has been the case for last 30 years. And since we have failed to push our governments to give priority to healthcare, education, or environment, you can't blame governments for focusing on religion, statues, and reservations, because that is what the people of the country want, you know. So that sums up the issues which we are facing. Since it's entirely in private sector now, if you look at India's total number of ventilators, almost 80% ventilators are in private sector. If you look at the private sector investments in hospital, most of them are listed players. So whether it's Apollo, Narayan Rudnalaya, SCG Global, Shelby Hospital, Fortis Hospital, all are listed players. And there is an inherent conflict for providing shareholder return, which is a quarter-on-quarter phenomena, which values your company and market cap, and what is good for the patient, and also tackling the government price caps and insurance protection. So I think the via media is the healthcare in private space has to survive. It has to make profits for enabling it to invest in research and newer equipment, but it should not profit here.
I think part of the problem, of course, and Shravan, this is something I'm sure you deal with on a regular basis. The reality is that the injection of capital, which guys like you can bring in, can transform the industry. We can't keep on remaining a cottage industry forever. What kind of steps have you taken in order to get a more favorable hearing from the powers that be?
Aniruddha, I think for any question regarding investment and favorable responses from people, we need to think about, as you started off, what is it that we're doing for patients? So working backwards from there, keeping health outcomes as the ultimate goal. There are a few steps along the way, right? Awareness is certainly one. We're enjoying a lot of that now. Access is critical, but once you have access, you need adoption. So if we're able to connect the dots on awareness, access, and adoption, then I think we will have the ear of the powers that be, and we'll be able to make a difference somewhere. Having said that, I want to be very cautious in saying that we don't want any hasty investment or investment in the wrong direction. We need to think about what could be sustainable in the long term, keeping the patient in the center of the conversation, and then establishing the framework that helps us look at all these steps. Access has been one of the key areas that companies like us, Roche, have been working on for a number of years in various countries. And there are several things that we can do for access, adoption of better technology, skill building, logistics. There are so many pieces to it. And the products are only one part of that journey. So we need to take the overall context and then identify the rate limiting steps and go after them aggressively, but in a sustainable manner.
Great. I think part of the problem, of course, is that investors have always been painted in a bad light. I mean, it's usually things like, all they're interested in is maximizing their ROI. But, that's part of their job description in a capitalistic society. Why would anyone give them money if that's not what they did? And I think that opportunity for you to actually catalyze disruptive innovations is huge. Would you like to talk a little bit about that, Pancha?
Absolutely. I completely firstly agree with you that, investors generally get painted in bad light, investing in a socially sensitive sector. But, we have fiduciary duties to investors behind us, right? It's not always proprietary capital that people come in with. You have limited partners, you have institutional capital backing you. And, institutional capital goes a long way in building capacity in a country like India. India, if you break up, for example, either on the diagnostic side or even on the hospital side, on the services side, right, a lot of capacity has been built in using institutional capital. And despite which, we are where we are in terms of healthcare spend per capita, beds per capita, tests per capita, and you can't really hit the institutional capital part of things so as hard as sort of sometimes we do take, hard approaches to people making money out of the sector. But, people give money to companies in order to generate certain returns, right? Having said that, you still have to make sure that in a country like India, where generally per capita incomes are low, people, patients coming knocking at your door either to get tested or treated, right? They are not sort of turned away. There has to be a balance between profit making so that it does not transcend into profiteering, especially in times like these, right? So you have it's a fine line to walk. And while walking the fine line, you have to make adequate returns. You cannot be assumed to take on all losses that regulators may impose in you, right? Because then it creates existential risk for institutional capital to come into the sector. But having said that, you don't want to sort of have supernormal profits also being made out of the sector, and even more so in times like this. You've had examples, some of them of billings, and we've all read about them, right?
So we're not going to go there for a minute.
Yeah.
And you're right, we need the goose, but we don't want the goose to lay golden eggs. We want the goose to lay silver eggs. And the fact of the matter is that if it's not an attractive domain for people to invest in, investors have choices. They don't have any obligation to necessarily invest in healthcare. And at some point they'll say, it's just not worth doing it. Having said that, there's obviously huge potential demand. It's an untapped market. We understand that. It's recession proof. And I think this is something which is very close to your heart, Sunil. Would you like to chime in and talk a little bit about what makes India so special in the healthcare market for investors?
Absolutely, Dr. Malpani. And I think India is one solid market where you can try and marry both social impact with returns for investors. And there are a variety of ways one can do it. And we've done it. And that's the motto of our fund. We are socially driven fund. But the way it should be done is where you bring all the stakeholders into picture. And unless you bring the entire ecosystem in a one aligned manner, it becomes very, very difficult. The government has to think about its role. That are they going to be regulators? Are they going to be payers? Which side of the game are they going to be play? And we have successful global models. Similarly, the businesses, they have to be very, very clear about their model. If they plan to build a solid, clinically driven, long-term business model, it's possible. We've done it, in our hospital in Hyderabad, which is the gastric sciences hospital. It's the leading gastric sciences hospital, been there for now over 20 years. The price points are at, half of what the average market charges, and we're making decent profit. Nobody's complaining. But then for that kind of a model to come, you need patient capital and you need a proper stakeholder alignment. And that is where we expect, investors, where we expect entrepreneurs, where we expect government to come and basically be very, very clear about each one's role. And it can be made possible. Arvind Eye Care is a great example. Shankar Nethralaya is a great example, where you have profitable ventures, sustainable ventures, catering to the wider bottom of the pyramid kind of people. So it's all possible. And in this day and age where India has an advantage even on the supply side of having the best scientific mind, engineering, and on the clinical side, you can very well use technology and a locally developed, locally encouraged technology to bring about change. But what is going to be very, very critical is the adoption. And how do you use adoption? Only when you get the entire, all the stakeholders, most importantly, the government, who's pressing for, socially viable healthcare model to be a dominant player and encourage these kind of entrepreneurs and business models.
So I think I like the fact that we're talking about the fact that you can create this successful marriage. And I think, PPP or public-private partnerships have been a buzzword for many years. But unfortunately, the success stories with some of these things have been few and far between. Like you said, why aren't there 100 more Arvind Eye Care models in different specialties all across this country? And I think the elephant in the room, especially for diagnostics, is the fact that, there's so much rampant kickbacks and commissions, is that a lot of the ethical players in the market don't get a chance to be able to earn money properly. And, a few bad apples end up ruining the entire basket. Is that something you'd agree with, Avinash? Why don't we talk about some of these things? Because if you just pretend that that problem doesn't exist, we're never going to be able to fix it.
Okay, so what I wanted to say, this kind of referral practices give a bad name to the entire diagnostic. And as all of us are aware, diagnostic is so important that almost 70 to 75% of clinical decision making is today based on diagnostic. For example, if anybody has fever, whether he has dengue, malaria, or chikungunya or hepatitis, the clinician is not going to know by examining the patient. So it entirely depends on the lab to provide him with the accurate diagnosis, which results in correct treatment. Now, the sad part is the labs, to some extent, themselves are also to blame for these kind of practices, because once they try to attract business by offering more and more discounts, I would say discounts given to patients are very valid because the beneficiary is the consumer. So I have nothing to say for low price chains who offer direct to consumers a price which is substantially lower than the market. But when a large chain offers a very discounted price to a collection center, and collection center in turn charges a markup price to the patient, it's a legalized referral. So that's all we can say. And that's the business model all the large chains who are listed are adopting. And the collection centers are third party. They are not owned by the lab chains. So the moral responsibility of doing ethical work, the lab gets away by saying that we are providing a subsidized rate to the collection center, and what in turn the franchisee does is none of our business. That's the business model we are following. And I think somewhere it will have to change, and the benefit will have to go directly to the patient himself.
So I think part of the problem, like you said, is everyone's happy to pass the buck and no one wants to be the first clean guy, so to say. And the justification is, if so-and-so is doing it, then why aren't I allowed to do it? But I think the impact of this means that doctors have become popular whipping boys, whether it's the media, the judiciary, the politicians. You know, the basic thing is doctors are crooked and you really can't trust them. And that's really sad. Would you like to say something about that, Pancham?
Yeah, so when I started practice, those were the days, and I'm sure when you started the practice also, that the doctors were enjoying a certain social status. What I find totally unacceptable now is a MBA person. I have nothing against MBAs, by the way, or finance guys, and I feel private sector investment is vital, without which we would not be having any tertiary care or any transplant program in the country. So having clarified that, I don't think many of them understand the modalities of dealing with senior doctors, and that becomes an issue. The second issue is the bureaucracy takes great pleasure in regulating a doctor. So an IAS officer, probably he has done BA and from St. Stephen's and given an entrance exam and has become an IAS officer. But he takes great pleasure in regulating a cardiologist or a neurosurgeon in a particular manner.
His mom wanted him to become a doctor, but he never got into medical college. So this is
I'm not saying that. Somewhere this has to change. I mean, the time also has come that the bureaucracy will have to be specialized. So somebody looking after healthcare would necessarily need to have a healthcare background. Somebody looking after, say, telecom would need to have telecommunication background. Unless there is all IAS officers know everything kind of a scenario which exists in the country changes, we are in for tough times. And that is happening in terms of various regulations getting updated during COVID times.
Pancham, this is something you have strong feelings about, right? Mr. Mukim, would you like to talk about it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Doctors are the favorite whipping boys for the last few years now, right? And I would just divert attention to one data fact, right? What is the supply of doctors in the country versus the demand for doctors, right? And with the scarce supply of clinicians, paramedical, right, staff, is it fair to make them, or is it even directionally correct to make them the whipping boys, given what this may trigger is a guy studying medicine today will be like, dude, I'm not going to study to get whipped tomorrow, right? So you have to play it, fairly. There are doctors who are extremely socially conscious. We have partnered with one such doctor promoter at Sayadri, and there is an entire community of doctors who's working to create workhorse models. As Sunil was alluding to, a model that is both socially conscious and profitable at the same time, right? So you have to work towards workhorse models, and regulation should be sort of more specific. It cannot be umbrella regulation like you have today, right? You have umbrella regulation coming in and hitting everybody and anybody, right? So people get penalized for something they have not even been practicing as a model, right? And that needs to change. And to that point, you know what Dr. Fatke said, you need more educated and more medically literate regulation coming in from that perspective.
You know, I think part of the problem, of course, is that healthcare has always been a wicked problem. In the sense, you know, it's a complex adaptive system. Just one person isn't going to be able to fix it. And of course, doctors are at the coalface, you know, they are and in the past, like Dr. Fatke said, we would think of them as knights. Today, you think of them as knaves. But the reality is, most of the time, they're either pawns or puppets. And in a way, I think that's actually an opportunity. And the only people who can actually bring that in is financial guys, because you actually have some of the ability to engineer change, which individual doctors or individual anyone is never going to be able to do. And I think, Sunil, you do this across the spectrum, right? Because just creating minimal viable products doesn't help. You need a minimal viable ecosystem in order to get these products to the market, which is exceptionally hard. Would you like to talk a little bit about what you're doing in Quad Health?
No, absolutely. You're right, Dr. Malpani, and at least we have the benefit of looking at models right from the early stage. We have a separate VC fund that does healthcare, but more on the disruptive early stage side, and Quadria does the growth stage. So we've had the benefit of looking at models right from the time it gets seeded, and we get the proof of concept, and then promoters want to commercialize. So brilliant minds, a good proof of concept, good user case examples, but the mortality rate is very, very high. I would say I would put that at 90-95%. And that's because, again, the ecosystem is not coming together. And they're solving the right kind of problem, across demand aggregation, across product solutions, and across the entire value chain, which is, logistics all across. But you don't have a big buyer base. You don't have, a support base. Could be from the government. And that is where, you see high mortality. And unfortunately, we also don't have a very vibrant venture ecosystem. So you don't have an ecosystem where different profile of funds keep coming at different stages and take on the risk, and help an entrepreneur right through the journey, till the end game, which is listing. The ecosystem is completely broken, either from a support base by government or large private sector players, or through a venture model where you have a vibrancy, more capital, more supply base. So the best of the minds, while they start out on a very positive note, there is that urge to jump and commercialize a product without stabilizing that product. And most time people fail in that. There are some, recent examples that one would have read. So that is needed, and we are trying to attempt that. But we need many such, venture capitalists, many such, private equity investors to encourage and create a robust system so that entrepreneurs can come up with a final product and are able to commercialize it.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is most entrepreneurs are going to say, hey, e-commerce is so much easier. That's where the success stories are. Why do all the matha pichi with the healthcare? And we'll just go ahead and, go for the low-hanging fruit. And I think, Shravan, this is something which is extremely important for you because, large multinational across the globe, you've been here for so many years, you have a doctor background. Why aren't the clinical entrepreneurs missing? Why aren't they the ones who kind of saying, hey, this isn't going to work anymore? We know what our patients want because we clinically qualified. And this is what the next steps need to be.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Niruddha. And I have a clinical background and I also have a management background. So I'm a whipping boy, depending on which side, which audience I'm facing.
Dono tujhko gali dete hai. Doctors tujhko gali dete hai. Okay.
Absolutely. And the thing is, there is some good innovation happening. But as Sunil made the point earlier, we need a complete ecosystem to support this. And when the ecosystem is available outside the country, you might turn to that. But there are some developments that have been happening over the last few years. We've seen quite a bit of progress on the pharmaceutical front. You're starting to see a lot of action on the medical device front, also on the healthcare delivery aspect. And now healthcare is also a global economy. You can't confine yourself to India anymore or say that I'm going to practice healthcare within these confines or sell this product within these confines. So you have access to technology from around the world, and it's happening very soon. As long as we have a robust intellectual property protection mechanism, I think that will be very interesting for innovators from other countries to come and experiment in India, and also improve the overall ecosystem, the understanding, the adoption of the latest technology. Now, for example, we have the Medical Technology Park in Visakhapatnam. That's a very interesting ecosystem where they are bringing together different parts of the puzzle for manufacturing of medical devices and also innovating on new products. So we are making some headway in that space. We do have to take a step back though and look at our education system. Is it designed for cookie cutter degrees where you get a certificate and you start practicing, or is it designed to allow some creativity, some lateral thinking, and take some risks? Do we have universities or funding bodies that provide an incubation system that allow you to bring these ideas, take those risks? Are corporate entities providing that space? I think we have a long way to go there. I think the intent exists, but we also have to have the appetite, we have to have the long-term view, and we have to have the deep pockets that Sunil Thakur has.
I think the great thing is, because it's, like you said, it's a long journey, the opportunity for innovators, for people to come up with new solutions is that much more. Huge potential, captive market. And I think it should no longer just be low cost. It should be high value. What can we do? And we're going to come up with solutions which obviously someone sitting in Silicon Valley is not going to. And I think that's what we need to be able to focus on. And it's huge. And I'd just like to, have maybe each of you guys just talk about 1 minute. If I gave you a check for $1 billion, what would you like to be able to see? Avinash, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, see, if you really give me $1 billion and my aim is to multiply the money, maybe I may not look at healthcare as a business opportunity, in India. Because why would I invest in a sector which is subject to severe regulatory pressures? So I will give you just an example. Now, epidemic-related capping of tests is fine. But WHO, for example, has come out with a list of essential tests, which is a right of every patient to access as a right, as a constitutional right. And once it becomes a constitutional right, what is the guarantee those tests which are essential, where the list is about 100 tests, will not get regulated? So it's a challenge. So long as there is no guarantee for a healthcare entrepreneur that he will not be subject to regulations which makes him not forget about earning supernormal profit, but his survival becomes difficult. His existence is challenged. Then why would I risk my $1 billion in healthcare in the first place?
I think you're so right. All these populist measures done on an ad hoc basis every 6 months and then they get changed, is an entrepreneur thinking about the next 10 years. And if he doesn't have that clarity, he's going to say, forget about it. What about you, Pancham?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with Dr. Fatke. As I mentioned earlier, measures need to be in line with where we need to be in the next 5 to 10 years as a country, not just populist. You can't use a sector to fulfill other than clinical or healthcare service related ambitions or aspirations. You have to use the sector for the sector, right? And as Everstone Capital, we have close to $400 to $500 million deployed across multiple healthcare avenues, be it hospitals, be it diagnostic devices, be it pharmaceutical businesses, online pharma, and diagnostics in the past. Pretty much everywhere in our hold periods, we've seen some regulation come in, which we had never thought would sort of impact the way we think about the sector and thesis. And this is despite doing a lot of work on regulatory pieces pre-investment, we've been surprised by regulation. So we need to definitely reduce the surprise element.
I think once you burnt your fingers, you're going to say, I can do better things with my money rather than put it here.
We're still bullish on the overall sector in India, but you have to plan carefully as to where are you regulation proof is how you have to think of it.
Yeah, instead of the regulation actually helping you to do a better job, it's actually turning out to be an obstacle, which is such a shame. We should be respecting and trusting each other, and that seems to have gone. What about you, Sunil?
Well, I have no choice but to invest in the sector. But if you were asking me in terms of allocation, Dr. Malpani, I would, in these times, I'm much safer investing in the feeder models than being in the frontline, investing in the frontline model. So if you see, the feeder models are not being touched. It's the hospitals or the pharma companies. So API is not being touched. API is being encouraged, but the end product is being touched. Hospitals are being touched, but everything that feeds into a hospital is not being touched. So in terms of allocation, I would have a substantial allocation to the feeder models than getting directly and being a frontline player. But again, it's an ever-changing environment. I can say that even in frontline, there are models that you can make a success out of. It's just about, how do you have an out-of-box thinking. There are so many innovative models. It's just, going back to the drawing board and see, can you just break it open and create a different workflow, different way to deliver healthcare. It's not easy, daunting, but there is that potential out there in the market.
And I think part of it is, like you quite correctly said, everything gets so lopsided that if you only invest in one sector and don't invest in the other, then by definition, you don't have a healthy ecosystem. So Shravan, what about all the other clinicians who passed out with you? How many of them say, Arey yaar, I wish we'd followed in your footsteps and not done clinical medicine?
I think the grass always looks greener on the other side, Aniruddha. I'm on these WhatsApp groups with my friends where I'm admiring all the good work that they're doing, the clinical work, the surgeries, and they look at what's happening on this side and they say, wow, you're in a place with so much innovation. So I think there is a balanced approach there. And we have to see what's the most we can make out of it. If I were to answer your previous question, on what I would do with $1 billion, I would invest it equally.
You have $1 billion already, Shravan, huh? That's why I didn't offer any more to you.
I would divide it equally amongst these three amazing gentlemen who are doing fabulous work and doing so much at the grassroots level as well as fomenting innovation. So I think we need a combination of what's happening at the front lines as well as innovation and education. So I think the opportunities are absolutely immense.
Okay, guys, great. You've been great. I think, if anyone has any last things, I would just like to say one thing. All of us are blessed that we work in a field which directly impacts people when they're at their most vulnerable. It's a service industry, and the reality is all of us are going to be patients. And here we have a chance of making a difference. Today it's someone else, tomorrow it's going to be our turn. And our entire focus needs to be on what do we do to make sure the patient gets the best deal. We add the most value to the patient's life, which is why one of my favorite things is what I call information therapy. How do we help patients to make the right decisions? And once we do that, everything will automatically fall into place because the patients are the voters. The patients are the ones who spend the money on the insurance policies, on the drugs or the medicines. But that's my 2 minutes. And, I don't want to have the last word. So I leave it up to you guys. 1 minute for each of you, and then we are wrapping up. Avinash, we start with you.
Okay, I think the most satisfying aspect of being in this profession is to see the outcomes in front of your eyes. You are able to help the patient diagnose somebody's breast cancer at an early stage by doing a refined biopsy and saving the lady from having a more aggressive disease, or diagnosing a seriously sick patient, doing a CSF and diagnosing some rare form of meningitis, and say he receives antifungal treatment and the life is saved. That's the most satisfying part. It's also equally true that most of the doctors really enjoy what they do. So if I have given the impression that the doctors are ones who are reluctant warriors, it's not true. Doctors are very willing warriors. All they want is not having unreasonable regulation. Certain degree of regulations and restrictions are mandatory for all of us to perform in our given profession, and government and the bureaucracy is within their rights to have those regulations. Otherwise, it will be free for all. So all the request would be make this sector more patient-centric, like you say. And the my customers are not only my patients, but my customers are my referring doctors and my own internal customers, who are the human resources which I have. And I have equal duty, as much as I have towards patient, as to see that my doctors and my technicians also make progress in their lives, and they are provided with a safe and healthy environment.
Pancham, yours.
Yeah. So, look, I think we'll have to figure out or retool our business models, right, as we go about it. Because whether it's diagnostics, whether it's hospitals, whether it's pharma products, you've seen it across the spectrum, or devices, pricing will always be under pressure. So you have to figure out the cost of delivery to be spec'd down. It could mean impacting doctors, paramedicals, anybody. But you have to have a model, which factors in profitable growth with a certain cost of delivery, impacted price points is how I.
Good. Sunil, yours?
So I echo your sentiment, Anirudh. The more we democratize healthcare, get it outside of the hospital into the consumer healthcare in the right way, the better would be the ecosystem. So that's going to be fundamental driver of what happens in the coming years. That's happening, but I think more encouraging things are yet to be seen, and we hope that happens pretty soon.
Good. And Shravan?
Aniruddha, I think we should avoid, falling into the trap of binary responses when it comes to healthcare. Should we go for price or should we go for quality? Should we regulate or should we not regulate? Should we make in India or should we import? And people tend to have very strong opinions about one or the other when the real answer, or probably the sustainable answer, lies somewhere in the middle. So I would leave you with the thought that we should probably develop a framework that, as you mentioned and Dr. Farke mentioned, we keep the patient at the center, we think about clinical outcomes. And then we have a decades-long view of this and not a short-term view of this. And we also recognize that healthcare, although it impacts individuals, we have to think about it from a population standpoint and from the perspective that it is part of a global ecosystem. So no simple answers. Think long term, think outcomes, and consider a nuanced approach towards investment and outcomes.
I think that's great. I remember one of my friends said if we made it a rule that every bureaucrat and every politician would be allowed to take medical care only in a government hospital, all our problems would get solved, whether it's diagnostic, therapeutics, last mile, or whatever else. And hopefully on that happy note, I thank you guys. This is fun. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge.
Thank you for sharing such a rich range of anecdotes from your personal and professional journey.